The first time I saw Joseph Beiler shoot a man, I thought I was watching a miracle or a blasphemy. I still have not decided which. Through my field glasses, at 300 yards in the freezing Belgian air, I watched a German machine gunner stand behind his MG-42 in a church bell tower, mouth open in a shout I could not hear. The gun was cutting my men down in the snow below, ripping them apart in neat little bursts. Then a single shot cracked from the ruined tree line beside me. The German jerked, staggered back, and I saw red bloom across his right shoulder. His hand fell away from the trigger. He collapsed out of sight. For 1 second I felt relief. Then another figure lunged into place behind the machine gun, grabbed the grips, and the MG-42 started again, louder than before. I lowered the binoculars and turned to the sniper lying prone on the frozen ground next to me. His cheek was still pressed to the wooden stock of his Springfield rifle. He did not look up. His gloved hands moved with the smooth rhythm of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Bolt back, casing out, bolt forward, round, chambered. Snowflakes landed on his helmet and did not melt. His name was Private First Class Joseph Beiler. He was 22 years old, and at that moment, I decided that I hated him. That was November of 1944. My name is Captain David Harris. Back then I was 26 and thought I understood war. I had been shot at, shelled, frozen, starved, and promoted for not dying. But until the day I met Beiler on that ridge overlooking the village, I had never met a man who could hit anything he wanted and still refuse to kill. The German in the tower kept firing. Below us, in the open field between our line and the village, men were going down in ones and twos, dark figures against white snow, stumbling, spinning, collapsing. The machine gun was zeroed perfectly on our avenue of advance. Every second it kept firing meant another scream, another body in the snow. The air smelled of cordite and pine sap, and something else metallic and heavy that I knew was blood. The sound of the MG-42 was not like the chattering of our Brownings. It was smoother, almost silky, a tearing canvas sound that got into the back of your teeth. I leaned close to Beiler's ear and ordered him to kill the gunner. No clever language, no euphemisms. Kill him. He did not argue. He did not hesitate. He did not give me a Bible verse. He simply said, "Yes, sir," and settled deeper behind the rifle. His breaths came slow and even, little clouds of vapor puffing from the edge of his scarf. He lay there in the snow like he had all the time in the world, while my men died in the field in front of us. Seconds stretched. The machine gun chewed another man apart. Someone down there was yelling for a medic who could not move without being cut in half. My fists clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms inside my gloves. Every part of me wanted to shove Beiler aside, grab his rifle, and pull the trigger myself. But the sniper sergeant had told me, when I took over the company after the last captain bled out in a ditch, that this kid was the best shot in the regiment. You do not drag the best shot in the regiment off his rifle because your nerves cannot handle the weight. So I watched. Through the binoculars, the bell tower was framed in a perfect little circle. The German gunner leaned into his weapon, emptying belt after belt into the field. Snow and stone chipped off the walls behind him. Then the world narrowed to a single instant. The German's head turned slightly. His mouth opened wider. Maybe he was shouting something. Maybe he was laughing. I will never know. A tiny, perfect circle appeared in the stone pillar beside his right hand. There was a blur of motion. His whole arm jerked sideways at an impossible angle. The MG-42 went silent mid-burst. He dropped out of sight, leaving only steam and smoke and an empty gun behind. My lungs emptied in a rush. Relief tasted like copper. Then another German, younger, thinner, scrambled into the gap, grabbed the grips with both hands, and hauled the machine gun back onto our men. The gun started again. I heard myself shout at Beiler over the roar, asking if he had missed, asking if he was blind, asking if he understood that every second this gun stayed active was a death sentence for my company. He did not flinch. He did not bristle. He did not even look at me. He just said, in the same calm voice he might use to comment on the weather, that he had hit the first gunner in the shoulder. The man would not be operating a machine gun again in this life. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that there was another one up there now. He went back to his rifle. My face felt hot despite the cold. I told him very clearly that I did not care which piece of German flesh his God had allowed him to perforate. I told him he was to put his next round through the gunner's skull. I told him that was a direct order from his commanding officer, and if he had a problem with it, the chaplain could pray over him in the stockade. He did not argue. He did not sermonize. He just adjusted his aim. Later, after the battle, one of the other snipers told me he watched Beiler's right hand on the trigger and his left on the forearm of the rifle. He said they did not twitch. Not once. Not while the machine gun was chewing up the field. Not while I was yelling at him. Not while shells were whistling overhead. He was a statue carved out of ice and steel. The second shot came sooner. The crack of the Springfield cut across the deeper hammering of the MG-42. In my binoculars, the second gunner's body jerked backward as if some invisible giant had tugged him by invisible strings threaded through his palms. The machine gun bucked, its barrel leaping toward the ceiling. Something metallic flew in the air. The German screamed. Even at that distance, even over the sound of gunfire, I saw his mouth open in a howl. His hands slapped against the stone as he fell, leaving dark smears behind. The machine gun slid forward and jammed against the edge of the tower opening, useless. This time, it did not start again. We took the village an hour later. The field in front of it looked like someone had spilled a bucket of red paint over fresh snow. Men lay where they had fallen, twisted in shapes no human body is meant to make. The medics stepped carefully between them, checking pulses, calling out names, tagging feet. I did not help. I walked with a patrol to the church. The stone steps up to the bell tower were narrow and slick with something that was not just melted snow. The closer we got, the stronger the smell became. Hot oil, burned powder, iron thick in the air. At the top, the bell tower opened into a low chamber with waist-high walls and an arched gap facing our lines. The MG-42 sat there like an idol on an altar, its barrel still smoking faintly in the cold. Two Germans lay crumpled around it. The first was slumped against the wall, head lolling, eyes rolled back to show only crescents of white. His right shoulder was gone. Not damaged. Gone. The round had torn through flesh and bone and muscle and turned the joint into a crater of red and white and shredded fabric. His field-gray tunic was black and stiff with frozen blood all the way down his side. His right arm dangled at a wrong angle, held to his body by skin alone. I had seen men shot before. Plenty. But the precision of that wound made my stomach tighten. It was surgical and savage at the same time. The second German was on his knees beside the gun. At first I thought his hands were resting on the stone, palms down, fingers spread. Then I realized his palms were not resting on the stone. They were nailed to it. There were two neat, round holes in the rock, one under each hand. Blood had pooled around them and dripped down the side in slow, syrupy lines. Both of the German's wrists were intact. The bones in his forearms were intact. The bullets had gone through the center of his palms, through the thin flesh and bones there, and then into the firing mechanism of the MG-42. The top cover of the gun was bent and cracked. The feed tray was shattered. I could see where metal had buckled around the path of the round. The German was conscious. His eyes were wide and wet. His breath came in short whimpers, fogging the cold air. He looked down at his hands, then up at us, then back down, as if repeating the motion would somehow make it less real. Every time he tried to move, his skin tore a little more around the embedded edges of the rock. One of my sergeants swore softly behind me. Another crossed himself. Nobody moved for a moment. We just stood there in that stone box with the bell overhead and watched a man pinned to the floor by invisible nails of lead and geometry. I knew without asking who had done it. It is one thing to hit a man at 300 yards. It is another to hit his hands. It is another again to hit both hands, with 2 shots in the middle of combat, while he is moving and firing and your own men are charging through the open below. That is not just marksmanship. That is something else. We cut the Germans' hands free. There is no good way to do that when a bullet has punched them into stone. The medic worked carefully, but the man screamed until his voice broke. I stood there and watched, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with the young man in my company who had done it. That night, back in our foxholes on the ridge, I went looking for Joseph Beiler. I found him sitting at the bottom of a shallow dugout, his back against the frozen earth, a stub of candle burning in front of him. The little light threw shadows up against the canvas overhead, making the walls seem to breathe. His rifle lay across his lap, bolt open, barrel already half cleaned. He looked up when I dropped into the hole and nodded respectfully, like I was visiting him in his living room instead of a muddy grave in Belgium. I did not sit. I did not make small talk. I asked him, plainly, why he had not killed those men, why he would risk the lives of everyone in his company to preserve the lives of 2 strangers who would not have shown us the same mercy. He listened without interrupting. He did not look away. His eyes were pale blue and very still. When I finished, he took a breath and answered in the same calm voice he had used on the ridge. He told me he had been raised Mennonite, that for as long as he could remember, he had been taught that every human life belonged to God, not to governments or generals. When the draft notice came, his pastor and family told him to refuse, to go to prison if he had to. He went to the hearing board and said he was a conscientious objector. The board looked at his hands, calloused from farm work, and asked if he would be willing to defend himself if someone tried to kill him. He said yes. They stamped his papers and sent him to infantry training. He told me that on the troop ship crossing the Atlantic, he made a deal with God. He would go. He would carry a rifle. He would not run. He would stand between his brothers and whatever came at them. But he would not kill if he could possibly avoid it. He would aim for shoulders, for hips, for knees, for hands. Places that would stop a man from fighting without stopping his heart. He said he believed God understood the difference. I told him war did not understand the difference. I told him there was no box on my reports for enemy morally inconvenienced. I told him my job was to win, and that required dead Germans, not injured ones. He said he knew how it sounded. He said he had walked through fields full of bodies just like I had, and wondered if he was insane. But then he explained something that made my skin crawl. Not because it was wrong, but because it was coldly, brutally correct. A dead man, he said, lays where he falls. Maybe one other man drags him a few yards out of the line of fire. Maybe nobody does. A wounded man demands attention. He needs 2 men to carry him. He needs a medic to treat him. He needs transport, bandages, bottles of plasma. He needs a hospital bed, a surgeon, months of resources. Every time Joseph put a German on the ground without killing him, he was tying up 3 or 4 other Germans who could have been shooting at us. I had seen that exact pattern play out for years. I had watched my own men carry wounded comrades through shell fire, leaving rifles lying in the mud so their hands would be free to hold on to the stretcher. I had cursed the weight of a single wounded man and how he dragged 4 healthy men out of the firing line with him. I had never put it into numbers. Joseph had. In that moment, in that hole, by that candle, I realized that he was not just trying to obey his conscience. He was using his conscience as a weapon. And I still wanted him gone. Because that same conscience, that same stubborn refusal to cross a line, forced me to look at my own hands. I could not remember the faces of most of the men I had ordered killed. They blurred together in my head. Gray uniforms, field caps, helmets, the back of a head in my sight picture. I slept fine most nights. Joseph did not. His eyes were already older than mine, and he was 4 years younger. For the rest of that month, I watched him like a hawk. Every engagement was the same pattern. We took fire. I called for the sniper. He moved up without rushing, found a perch, and lay still. 1 shot. A German fell down, screaming and clutching a limb that suddenly did not work anymore. 2 more Germans dropped their weapons to drag him away. The pressure on our line eased, just enough for my boys to get their heads up and their boots moving. Afterward, when we walked the field and counted bodies, we found very few with bullet holes from Joseph's rifle in their chests or skulls. We found dozens with wounds that would cripple them for life. The men in the company noticed. At first they joked. They called him the Quaker, the Saint, the half-measure kid. Then, as the weeks rolled by and the snow piled higher and the casualty lists grew longer, the jokes soured. One night, a sergeant came to my command post with frost-bitten cheeks and murder in his eyes. His brother had been killed that afternoon by a German patrol. When they searched the bodies, they found one with a fresh bandage on his upper arm and an American bullet lodged in the meat beneath. The sergeant was certain, absolutely certain, that Joseph had put that bullet there a week before and spared the man's life. He stood in front of my desk and told me, in a shaking voice, that his brother was dead because my sniper would not do his job properly. I could not prove him wrong. I did not even try. I sent him away and sat alone with the maps and the candles and the distant thunder of artillery. And I let the anger I had been holding back settle into something hard and cold. It was easier to be angry at Joseph than to be angry at the war, or at myself, or at whatever God was watching all of this with folded arms. So I made a decision. I pulled out a blank form and began writing up charges. Failure to follow direct orders, willful disobedience in combat, endangering the lives of fellow soldiers. I laid out the incidents in careful detail. The church tower, the farmhouse sniper whose eye he had ruined instead of his brain, the officer he had put down with a hip shot instead of a kill. Every line I wrote felt like a betrayal. Every line also felt like a relief. If I could remove him from my command, I would no longer have to watch him balance on that razor's edge between saint and soldier. I was halfway through the report when the first shell hit. The floor of the schoolhouse where we had set up our command post leapt under my boots. The lamp swung wildly and smashed against the wall, throwing glass and flaming oil across the room. Someone outside screamed, a high, cut-off sound. I went to the window and saw the horizon light up in a jagged line of orange. The night exploded into daylight and thunder. The German counterattack had begun. The second attack started before dawn, while the smoke from the first one was still hanging over the trees like a low black ceiling. Artillery woke us up. Not the lazy, harassing shells we were used to at night, but a full barrage, the kind that picked up the earth and shook it like a dog with a rag. I remember the way the frozen ground bucked under my body, the way the air itself seemed to be made of splinters. Somewhere outside, men were yelling without words. Somewhere closer, glass shattered and bricks tore loose from walls. The schoolhouse that had been our command post an hour earlier was coughing dust from every crack. I had spent half the night writing charges against Joseph Beiler. The paper was still on the table when the first shell hit, the ink not yet dry. When the lamp exploded and the room jumped sideways, the report flew into the air and vanished in a snow of other papers. For a second I reached for it, like a reflex. Then another shell landed closer, and the instinct burned away. There was no more room in my head for bureaucracy, only survival. I grabbed my helmet, my carbine, and my map case and ran for the door as the building tried its best to collapse around me. Outside, the darkness was flashing on and off like a broken light. Every artillery burst lit up the snow, the trees, the low stone walls of the village in harsh white snapshots. In one flash, I saw a truck on its side, wheels spinning uselessly. In another, I saw a man running without his helmet, mouth open, arms bent at wrong angles. In the next, I saw nothing but a wall of earth coming at me. The blast picked me up and threw me into a roadside ditch half full of icy water. The shock knocked the breath out of my lungs. For a moment, all I could hear was a high, thin whistle inside my own skull. When the world swam back into focus, I was on my back, staring up at a sky that alternated between black and orange. Snowflakes were falling through smoke, turning gray before they reached my face. I rolled over, spat blood and mud, and hauled myself upright. The air was filled with the layered noise of a real attack, artillery in the distance, small arms nearby, the occasional deeper roar of a tank gun, men shouting over all of it, some in English, some in German. There is a particular tone to voices when a line is about to break. I heard that tone now. I needed to know where the hit was coming from. I needed my snipers. I needed Joseph. I ran bent over along the ditch, slipping on ice, ducking automatically when rounds cracked overhead. Shapes moved through the smoke around me, some with helmets, some without. A medic burst out of the fog, his white band on his helmet already streaked with red, dragging a man by his webbing harness. He did not even look at me as we nearly collided. His entire world was the dead weight in his hands. That was when the first lesson of Joseph's philosophy punched me in the gut with the force of a physical blow. In the backwash of an artillery flare, I saw 3 dark shapes stumbling across the field toward the German tree line. One in the middle was barely on his feet, his left leg stiff and dragging, his right arm hanging limp. On either side of him, 2 more men propped him up, one hand under each shoulder, their rifles slung useless across their backs. Behind them, their squad was still in cover, pinned by our fire, taking no part in the fight because 3 of their number were now occupied with one man's wound. I did not have a scope. I did not need one. Even at that distance, in that light, I recognized the way the injured man moved. Hip shot. The leg would never work the same way again. The man would never fight again. And yet, right now, in this moment, he was worth 3 sets of hands pulled out of the battle. One bullet had done that. One bullet from a kid in my company who would not aim for the chest. Shells kept falling, men kept running, but in that instant, with mud freezing on my face and my ears ringing, the arithmetic that Joseph had tried to explain to me in my foxhole became more than theory. It was there in front of me, in the shape of 3 Germans vanishing into the trees, leaving their rifles untouched in the snow. I shook it off and kept moving. Philosophy would not hold the line. Not by itself. We had put Joseph in the 2nd story of a brick farmhouse on the right flank at last light, after the first attack. It had a clear view over the shallow valley the Germans would have to cross if they wanted to turn us. I sprinted for that house now, slipping on shattered roof tiles, feeling the heat of a nearby impact on my face like an oven door opening. Inside, the ground floor was chaos. Men filled the narrow hallway, some trying to get out, some trying to get in, all yelling at once. The air was thick with plaster dust and the bitter smell of burned wood. A man sat on the floor with his back against the wall, staring at the stump where his hand had been an hour ago, fingers now a red stain on the opposite wall. Another was laughing hysterically, a high, broken sound, until someone slapped him hard enough to knock him sideways. I pushed through them, shouting my name and rank, and took the stairs 2 at a time. At the top, the world narrowed again. The room Joseph had chosen was small and cold, with one window blown out completely and another spider-webbed with cracks. The floor was covered in a drift of brick dust and broken glass. In the far corner, propped against the inner wall, sat Joseph. He looked as if he had grown there overnight. His back was straight. His left elbow was braced on his knee, his hand cupping the forestock of the rifle. His right hand lay loose on the trigger. His cheek was welded to the stock, his eye glued to the scope. The candlelight that had made him look human in the foxhole was gone. What was left was a line of tension from his boots to the tip of the barrel, one unbroken arc of purpose. The floor around him glittered with brass. Empty shell casings had piled up in a rough circle, shifting under his boots when he moved the slightest bit. There were dozens of them. More than that. The air in the room was warm from the steady firing, despite the holes in the wall. A thin line of smoke trailed from the rifle's barrel, curling lazily, as if oblivious to the violence it had been part of. I called his name. He did not answer. I stepped closer, careful not to kick the pile of brass. When I spoke again, louder, he flinched so slightly I might have missed it if I had not been searching for any sign he was still made of flesh. "Where do you need fire?" he asked, without looking away from the scope. I fought back the urge to drag him away from the window and shake him the way I had wanted to on the ridge. I forced myself to kneel beside him and look through the broken pane instead. The valley beyond the farmhouse was a churned gray mess. Snow, dirt, bodies, equipment, all blended together in a single ugly carpet. Flares popped over the German line, painting everything in sickly green. In that light, the wounded writhed like things from a nightmare, crawling, clawing, leaving dark streaks behind them. Here and there, muzzle flashes winked like fireflies, hard to place in the chaos. "You see that hedgerow?" Joseph murmured, almost under his breath. 220 yards, just left of the burned cart. I found it. A ragged line of brush and low trees, half blown apart by shells. For a moment I saw nothing, Then a shape rose out of it, hunched, helmeted, carrying something heavy that flashed in the flare light. "Machine gun team," Joseph said. "3 men. 1 carrying the gun, 2 with ammunition. They are going to try to set up and rake our retreat line if we fall back." I reached for my field glasses out of habit. By the time I had them to my eyes, Joseph's rifle had cracked. In the scope's line of sight, the man carrying the gun staggered. The MG tumbled out of his hands and into the mud. He did not fall. He dropped to one knee, grabbing for his thigh with both hands as if trying to hold something inside. The other 2 men abandoned the gun immediately and bent to haul him upright, their own weapons hanging useless against their chests. They turned and began the slow, clumsy walk back toward the tree line, half dragging, half carrying their burden. The machine gun lay where it had fallen, black and heavy and harmless. No second team appeared to take their place. 1 shot, 3 rifles gone. 1 more knot pulled in the invisible rope that was strangling the German advance. Joseph exhaled slowly. His breath puffed against the rifle's stock and disappeared. "You still making your notes?" I asked, surprising myself. Without taking his eye from the scope, he nodded toward the floor next to him. His small, battered notebook lay open there, the pencil tucked into its spine. The top page was already crowded with tiny lines of writing. Time, distance, description, leg, shoulder, hand. Between shells, between shots, he was cataloging each decision, not as trophies, as debts. Another flare went up. Another wave of infantry surged out of the tree line, running low, some stumbling, some dragging sleds with ammunition. Joseph tracked them. I watched his finger on the trigger. It did not tighten. It waited. He chose 1 man slightly ahead of the rest, a corporal by the stripes on his sleeve, shouting back over his shoulder, waving them forward with 1 arm. The other arm clutched a map case to his chest. The shot landed in the corporal's right elbow. It was obscene how clean it was. 1 second the arm moved freely. The next it flopped loose, the map case dropping into the snow. The corporal screamed and went down. 3 men broke formation immediately to get to him. The wave wavered and faltered. For 15 seconds, an eternity in that kind of fight, no one was looking at our line. No one was aiming. In those seconds, our own rifles spoke from the rubble around the farmhouse. Men who had been pinned rose just enough to fire. Several Germans who had not been hit by Joseph went down and did not get back up. I saw all of this in jagged, half-connected flashes, but one image drove itself into my mind and stayed there. The map case lay open in the snow where the corporal had dropped it. Pages fluttered in the wind, held by one remaining strap. Lines and arrows and numbers scrawled by some German staff officer somewhere far from this particular patch of hell. We never would have seen those pages if the shot had taken the corporal in the head. "Get me that?" I said, already turning to go. Downstairs, I grabbed 2 men who still had their wits and their feet under them. We sprinted from cover to cover, hugging walls, timing our runs between the heavier shells. Bullets snapped overhead and kicked up plumes of dirty snow at our heels. When we reached the half-shattered stone wall at the edge of the valley, I pointed with my chin. "Map case, 2 o'clock, 30 yards. We are bringing it back." They did not argue. Men who have been close to death long enough stop bothering with big questions. They just do the thing in front of them and hope it matters. We went over the wall together. My boots slipped on something soft, and I did not let myself look down to see if it was mud or a body. The map case lay in a shallow depression, half covered by drifted snow, its pages now spattered with dark spots that were not ink. The corporal was not far away. He was still alive, clutching his ruined arm to his chest and making a noise like a saw on wet wood. For a moment, just a moment, our eyes met. His were not the eyes of a monster. They were the eyes of a tired, frightened man who had been told this was all for a reason. His lips moved. I did not know what he was saying. Maybe a prayer. Maybe a curse. One of my men grabbed the map case. The other threw a smoke grenade, filling the air with a dirty white curtain. As the smoke bloomed around us, I heard the corporal start to laugh, a high, almost hysterical sound, cut short when another shell landed somewhere close behind us, and the concussion punched the breath out of our lungs again. We made it back to the farmhouse with the case. Inside, in the relative shelter of the broken stairwell, I flipped it open. Even with my limited German, I understood enough. Arrows drawn through our sector, timetables, units. There was an entire battalion symbol lined up to roll right over Baker Company before dark. We got that information to battalion headquarters by runner. They shifted artillery. They rerouted reserves. By afternoon, the attack that should have crushed us had turned into a messy stalemate. We bled. God, did we bleed. But we did not break. That night, when the guns finally slowed from a roar to an irregular grumble, I went back upstairs to the little room. The brass shell casings had spread even farther, like a golden tide around Joseph's boots. He sat in the same spot, shoulders slumped now, rifle resting across his legs. The adrenaline had drained out of him, leaving only the shaking behind. His hands trembled so badly he could barely get the cleaning rod down the barrel. On the floor beside him, the notebook was open to a fresh page. The last line he had written was still half finished, the pencil snapped in two beside it. Left elbow. One officer. Map. I picked up the broken pencil and turned it over in my fingers. The point had snapped under pressure, not from a fall. For some reason, that detail hit me harder than the sight of any wound that day. It meant there had been a moment up here in this little room when Joseph had tried to press his thoughts onto paper and his own hand had betrayed him. He looked up at me and tried to smile. It did not reach his eyes. "Captain," he said. His voice was raw. We held, I agreed. "And you did that. You understand that, right?" He looked past me, out through the broken window, over the valley that was now a patchwork of craters and corpses and twisted metal. "I saw every one of them," he said softly. "Every time I pulled the trigger, I saw their faces. Even when I was aiming at hands or legs, they all looked surprised." There was no pride in his voice, no satisfaction, only exhaustion and something heavier, like wet clothes clinging to a man who has been walking in the rain too long. I wanted to tell him that what he had done was necessary, that the German corporal whose elbow he had destroyed would live to go home, that the worst thing that had happened to that man today was that he would spend the rest of his life telling people about the day some American sniper spared him. But I remembered the schoolhouse full of my wounded. I remembered my own men staring at the stumps where hands used to be. I remembered the sergeant who had come to me, eyes full of hate, blaming Joseph for his brother's death. And I knew that, in the arithmetic of war, mercy and cruelty often sat on the same side of the ledger. So I said nothing. For once, silence was the only honest answer. Outside, distant guns rumbled like an approaching storm that never quite arrived. The candle at Joseph's feet burned low, wax pooling around its base like another kind of casualty. His notebook lay open, waiting for the next line that would turn a human being into an entry on a page. I thought about the half-finished report buried somewhere under the rubble of the command post. The words I had written accusing him of cowardice, of disobedience, of endangering his fellow soldiers. I realized, with a slow, reluctant horror, that if I had succeeded in getting him pulled out that morning, Baker Company would not exist tonight. I also realized that did not make it any easier to look him in the eye. For the second time in as many days, Joseph Beiler had forced me, without ever raising his voice, to see something about myself I did not want to see. He had shown me that you could turn a conscience into a weapon, and I had no defense against that. Down in the valley, where the snow was no longer white, men were still moaning in the dark. Some in German, some in English, some in a language made only of pain. The war was not done with us, and it was nowhere near done with him. The war ended for Joseph Beiler on April the 23rd, 1945, in a town so small it did not have a name on any of our maps. We called it Crossroads, because that was all it was. 2 dirt roads meeting in front of a stone church with half a steeple. By the time we got there, the church was on fire, and the roads were lined with rubble that used to be houses. Germany was dying. You could feel it in the air, taste it in the smoke. The Wehrmacht was not an army anymore. It was pieces of armies held together by nothing but momentum and fear. We had been chasing ghosts for weeks, moving faster than our supply lines could follow, living on cigarettes and adrenaline and the quiet, unspoken hope that maybe, just maybe, we would make it home. Joseph had stopped writing in his notebook 3 days earlier. I noticed because he always wrote at night, by candlelight or moonlight, carefully recording each shot as if God was going to ask for an accounting. But one morning, I saw the notebook tucked into his pack, unopened. When I asked him about it, he just shook his head and said he had run out of pages. I did not believe him. I had seen that notebook. It was half empty. What he had run out of was the ability to turn men into entries on a ledger. The weight of all those names, all those wounds, all those faces seen through a scope at the moment a bullet found them, had finally become too much to carry in ink. We entered Crossroads just after dawn. The streets were empty except for smoke and the crackle of burning wood. No civilians, no defenders, just silence and ash. It should have been a relief. It felt like a trap. I split the company into 3 groups, one to clear the church, one to sweep the eastern approach, and one led by me to secure the remains of what looked like a schoolhouse on the northern edge of town. Joseph came with my group, not because I ordered it, because by then, after 5 months of watching him work, I had learned something the Army never taught me in officer school. Some men do not need orders. They just gravitate toward the place they are needed most. The schoolhouse had taken a direct hit from something big. The second floor was gone entirely, leaving only jagged walls open to the sky like broken teeth. The ground floor sagged inward, held up by beams that groaned every time the wind shifted. We moved through it carefully, rifles up, boots crunching on shattered glass and plaster. In what had been a classroom, we found them. 4 German soldiers. Boys, really. The oldest could not have been more than 17. They were huddled in the corner farthest from the windows, their rifles stacked neatly against the wall 10 feet away from them, hands raised, faces pale. They were not SS. They were not fanatics. They were conscripts in uniforms 2 sizes too big, pulled from farms and factories in the last desperate weeks of a war their country had already lost. One of them was crying silently, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on his cheeks. My sergeant raised his Thompson, waiting for my word. The rest of my men fanned out, covering angles, fingers on triggers. In that moment, the room balanced on a razor's edge. We were tired. We were angry. We had buried too many friends. It would have been easy. It would have been legal, even, under the right interpretation of the rules. They were armed enemy combatants in a combat zone. We could have ended it right there and written it up as resistance. I looked at Joseph. He was standing slightly behind me, his Springfield slung across his back, hands loose at his sides. He was not aiming at anyone. He was just watching. His face was blank, but his eyes were not. In his eyes I saw something I had never seen before in all the months I had known him. Exhaustion. Not the physical kind. The kind that lives in the soul. I lowered my carbine. I told the sergeant to take their weapons and get them outside. We would process them as prisoners. The tension in the room broke like a wire snapping. My men moved forward, roughly but not cruelly, pulling the Germans to their feet and herding them toward the door. Joseph did not move. He stood in the ruined classroom, staring at the rifles stacked against the wall. After the others had gone, I walked over to him. "You all right?" I asked. He nodded slowly. Then he said very quietly, "I have been counting." "Counting what?" "How many I did not have to shoot." I did not understand at first. Then I did. For 5 months, Joseph had been cataloging the men he wounded, but he had never written down the other list. The men who surrendered before he had to fire. The men who retreated before he had to aim. The battles that ended without him pulling the trigger at all. Those he had been counting in his head, and the number was bigger than the one in the notebook. Before I could respond, gunfire erupted outside. It was not the heavy, sustained fire of an engagement. It was sharp and panicked, a few rifles going off all at once, then stopping, then starting again. Shouts followed. I recognized my sergeant's voice, high and urgent. Joseph and I ran for the door at the same time. Outside, the street had come alive. The 4 prisoners were on the ground, hands over their heads. My men were scattered behind cover, aiming at the upper windows of the buildings across the road. And from one of those windows, maybe 60 yards away, muzzle flashes strobed in the dim morning light. A sniper, or what passed for one in the wreckage of the German army. 2 of my men were already down, one clutching his leg, one not moving at all. The sniper was firing wildly, erratically, but in a street that narrow, luck was almost as good as skill. Another round cracked past my head and punched a hole in the wall behind me. Brick dust puffed into the air. I dropped behind the nearest pile of rubble and tried to locate the shooter. 3rd floor, eastern window. The glass was already gone. I could see movement in the shadows, the outline of a rifle barrel jerking left and right. Joseph was beside me. He had unslung his Springfield and was settling into position with the smooth, mechanical calm of a man who had done this hundreds of times. But when I glanced at his face, I saw something different. His jaw was set too tight. His breathing was faster than it should have been. For the first time since I had met him, Joseph Beiler looked rattled. "You have the shot?" I asked. He nodded, but he did not fire. Through the scope, he would be able to see more than I could. He would see the sniper's face. He would see how young he was, how scared. He would see the way the rifle shook in hands that did not know how to hold it properly. "Joseph," I said, my voice harder now, "take him out." Still he did not fire. His finger rested on the trigger guard, not the trigger itself. His eye stayed glued to the scope, but his hands, those steady hands that had never wavered under the worst fire I had ever seen, were shaking. Another shot from the window. This one hit the man next to me in the shoulder. He screamed and rolled away, clutching the wound. Blood spread across his jacket in a dark, wet bloom. "Joseph!" I shouted. "Now!" He squeezed the trigger. The Springfield cracked. Across the street in the third-floor window, I saw the German sniper jerk backward. His rifle tumbled forward, clattering onto the street below. For a moment, there was silence. Then a figure appeared in the window, staggering, one hand pressed to his face. Not his chest, not his throat, his face. Joseph had shot the scope. The optic had shattered, driving glass fragments into the boy's right eye and cheek. He was screaming now, a high, ragged sound that carried over the ruins. He stumbled out of sight, deeper into the building, his cries fading as he ran. My men did not wait for orders. They stormed the building, boots hammering on broken stairs. I heard more shouts, a single gunshot, then silence. When they came back out, they were dragging the German sniper by his arms. He was younger than I had thought. 15, maybe 16. His face was a ruin of blood and torn skin. The right side of his head was bandaged with a strip torn from his own shirt, already soaked through. He was sobbing uncontrollably, the kind of crying that comes from shock and pain and the sudden, terrible understanding that your life has just changed forever. They threw him down next to the other prisoners. He curled into a ball, both hands over his face, rocking back and forth. I turned to Joseph. He was still in his firing position, but the rifle had sagged in his hands. He was staring at the boy on the ground with an expression I could not read. Not satisfaction, not regret. Something worse. Something empty. "You could have killed him," I said. It was not an accusation, just a fact. "Yes," Joseph said. "Why didn't you?" He did not answer. He just lowered the rifle and walked away, back toward the schoolhouse, leaving me standing there with the taste of smoke in my mouth and the sound of a child crying in German ringing in my ears. We set up a temporary aid station in the least damaged building we could find. The medics went to work on our wounded first, then, because that was the rule, on the German prisoners. The boy with the destroyed eye was in bad shape. The medic told me he would live, but the eye was gone and the scarring would be permanent. He would go home to whatever was left of Germany with half his face held together by stitches and the memory of the day an American sniper had spared his life by taking his sight. I found Joseph sitting on the steps of the church, watching the fire inside burn itself out. The roof had collapsed, sending sparks spiraling up into the gray sky. He had his notebook open on his knee, but he was not writing. He was just staring at the blank page. I sat down next to him without asking permission. "You know what happens now, right?" I said. "That kid goes home. Maybe in a year, maybe in 5, he tells his children about the war, about the American who shot his scope instead of his head. And they grow up thinking maybe we were not all monsters." Joseph closed the notebook slowly. "Or," he said, his voice so quiet I almost missed it, "he goes home and spends the rest of his life half blind, hating me for what I took from him, hating Americans, teaching his children to hate, and in 20 years, we do this all over again." I had no answer for that, because he was right. Both things were possible. Maybe both things were true. We sat in silence while the church burned and the medics worked and the war ground on without us, indifferent to philosophy. That afternoon, we received orders to move out. The Germans were collapsing faster than we could advance. Command wanted us to push east, cut off a retreating column, secure a bridge. The usual. We packed up, loaded the prisoners onto a truck, and started moving. Joseph walked at the front of the column with me. He had not spoken since the church. His rifle was slung across his back, the barrel cold, the chamber empty. I had watched him check it 3 times in the last hour, as if he did not trust his own memory. We were 2 miles outside Crossroads when the sound reached us. It was faint at first, buried under the noise of boots and equipment and the low rumble of engines. But it grew louder, sharper, until even the newest private recognized it for what it was. Incoming artillery. The shells landed behind us. Not on us. Behind. Right where we had been an hour before. I grabbed my radio operator and called back to the aid station we had left in Crossroads. No answer. I tried again. Static. On the third try, a voice came through, broken and frantic. The town was under fire. They were taking casualties. They needed help. I made a decision I have regretted every day since. I told the company to hold position. I took 4 men, including Joseph, and we ran back the way we had come. By the time we reached Crossroads, the shelling had stopped. What was left of the town was burning. The building we had used as an aid station had taken a direct hit. The walls were gone. The medics were gone. The wounded were scattered across the street in pieces too small to name. And in the middle of it all, lying in the dirt with his hands over his head, was the German boy with the bandaged face. He was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he had survived. The blast had thrown him clear of the building. He was covered in dust and blood, some of it his, some of it not. When he heard us approaching, he tried to crawl away, dragging himself with one arm, the other hanging limp and useless. Joseph saw him and stopped dead. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The boy looked up, his one good eye wide with terror, and I saw the exact second he recognized Joseph. Not by face, by the rifle, by the shape of the man who had spared him and ruined him in the same instant. Joseph knelt down slowly, setting his rifle on the ground beside him. He reached into his pack and pulled out his canteen. He held it out. The boy flinched. Then hesitantly, he took it. His hands shook so badly he could barely unscrew the cap. When he drank, water ran down his chin and mixed with the blood there. That was when the second wave of shells came in. I do not know if it was German artillery or ours. In the chaos of a collapsing front, it could have been either. It did not matter. The first shell hit 50 yards to our left. The second hit 20 yards to our right. The third was going to land directly on top of us. I knew it the way you know some things in war, a certainty that lives in the gut, below thought. I shouted for everyone to get down, my men scattered. I threw myself behind a low wall, and Joseph, who had reflexes honed by 5 months of combat, who could have been in cover before the shell even landed, stayed exactly where he was. He covered the boy with his own body. The blast picked them both up and hurled them across the street like dolls. I felt the concussion in my teeth, tasted copper and smoke. When the dust settled and my ears stopped ringing, I pulled myself upright and stumbled toward them. The boy was alive. Barely, he was unconscious, bleeding from new wounds, but his chest was still moving. Joseph had taken the worst of it. Shrapnel had torn through his back and side, ripping open his jacket and the flesh beneath. Blood was spreading in a dark pool under him, soaking into the dirt. His face was turned toward me, eyes half open. One of his hands was still stretched out, as if reaching for something just beyond his fingertips. I dropped to my knees beside him and pressed both hands against the largest wound, trying to hold the blood inside him. It poured over my fingers, hot and slick. I yelled for a medic, knowing there were none left. I yelled anyway. Joseph's lips moved. I leaned closer, my ear almost touching his mouth. "Did I?" he whispered. The words came slow, each one a fight. "Did I save him?" I looked over at the German boy. One of my men was already working on him, wrapping wounds, checking for broken bones. He would live. Again. Yes, I said. My voice cracked. You saved him. Joseph's eyes closed. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Good, he breathed. That is 401. His hand, the one that had been reaching, went slack. I sat there in the dirt with his blood on my hands and his body growing cold against my knees, and I understood, finally, what he had been trying to tell me from the beginning. He had not been counting the men he wounded. He had been counting the men he saved. Every German he hit instead of killed was a son who went home to a mother, a husband who went home to a wife, a father who would meet children he had not seen yet. Joseph had carried the weight of 401 lives, not as victories, but as debts he owed to a God who commanded him not to kill. And in the end, he had added one more to the ledger. A boy who hated him, a boy who would carry scars for the rest of his life, a boy who would live. We buried Joseph in a field outside Crossroads, in sight of the church where he had sat and watched the fire burn. I read a passage from the Bible one of the men had in his pack, though I do not remember which one. My voice shook too badly to make sense of the words. The German boy lived. We evacuated him with our own wounded. 6 months later, after the surrender, after the trials, after the world had tried and failed to make sense of what we had done to each other, I received a letter. It was from a town in Bavaria. The handwriting was careful, the English broken but readable. It was from the boy Joseph had saved twice. He wrote that he was home. He wrote that his mother cried when she saw his face but held him anyway. He wrote that he thought about the American sniper every day and did not know whether to curse him or thank him. At the bottom of the letter, in a postscript, he wrote, I am alive because of him. I will make that mean something. I kept that letter for 42 years. I am holding it now as I tell you this story. The paper is yellow and fragile, the ink faded, but the words are still there. Joseph Beiler fired 427 shots in combat. He wounded 401 men. He killed 0. The army gave him the Soldier's Medal posthumously. They called him a hero. They were right, but not for the reasons they thought. He was not a hero because he was brave. He was a hero because he refused to let the war make him into something he was not. He carried a rifle for 5 months and never let it turn him into a killer. And when the moment came to choose between his own life and the life of a boy who would have let him die, he made the same choice he had been making all along. He chose mercy. I am 73 years old now. I have spent more years living with the memory of Joseph Beiler than I spent knowing him. And I wake up every morning with the same question I had that day in the church, sitting on the steps while the fire burned. Was he right? I do not know. I will never know. But I know this. I commanded a lot of men in that war. I watched them fight and bleed and die. I gave orders that sent them into hell and hoped they would come out the other side. Joseph Beiler was the best soldier I ever served with. Not because he killed the most enemy, but because he saved the most lives. And that is a kind of courage the medals cannot measure.